to bring together four renowned scholars on a topic that I think you will all find compelling, namely China, and China's rise is the title of the book. I'm Leipziger. I'm one of the VPs at the bank, and I'd like to introduce our four distinguished guests who have put together this book, and then tell you quickly what the order of events is and what we're going to do. Starting at this end, we have Charles Freeman, who comes to us from the CSIS, where he holds the China Studies Chair. Charles was previously the managing director of the China Alliance and worked in USTR and a number of other places. I have an elaborate bio, but in the interest of time, I think we'll be quick. Next is Derek Mitchell, who's a senior fellow and director for Asia at the CSIS, and previously worked in the Department of Defense in a number of responsible positions dealing with Asia. On my right, Nicholas Lardy is the senior fellow at the Peterson Institute for International Economics, working on China, previously at Brookings and well known to those that read on China. And then at the very end, a newcomer to Washington, Fred Bergsten, the founding director of the Peterson Institute for International Economics, and well known to you all. Before we get started, I think it's notable that we have such a good turnout in a working day at 3 o'clock, which is normally cappuccino time in the World Bank. And I think one of the reasons may be that no matter what issue you are concerned about these days, all roads seem to point in one way or another to China. So if you're interested in figuring out whether or not we're going to have a global recession or a global depression, it sort of hinges on China's growth rate in 2009. If you want to look at energy markets, energy demand, or carbon emissions, it sort of depends on what China is going to do. If you're interested in looking at the composition of growth and what's going to happen in international trade patterns, China is the big player. If you want to talk about the new international architecture and what the meeting on November 15th might bring, China is one of the new players that needs to be brought into the equation. So the good news is on each of these topics there's a chapter in this book. There's a chapter on growth, there's a chapter on China's role in the world, there's a chapter on China in the world architecture, and another one on internal, and one on energy. On top of that, there are chapters on internal political matters, relations that we in the bank are quite interested in countries, the relationship between the center and the periphery, as you want to call it, inside countries. And in China, obviously, the urban-rural issue is very prominent, so this is of great importance. There are chapters on corruption, which is near and dear to many of you in the room. There are chapters on military expenditures and outlook, which we only look at peripherally, usually because we want it to be reduced so we can spend on more interesting things. There's a chapter on democracy, and one on Taiwan, and also another on kind of policy challenges that China faces. So I think it's a great collection of work on issues that are relevant for China, but more so on issues that are relevant for the rest of the world for the reasons that I described. So what we're going to do is we're going to have each of these four authors speak for 10 minutes. After 10 minutes, I will waive the book and sort of explain that book sales are lagging because the speaker has gone on too long. And we have an order which is carefully orchestrated so that both Peterson and CSIS feel comfortable and the economists and the other social scientists feel comfortable. And so we're going to start with Nick Lardy as the first, and then we'll move to Charles, Derek, and Fred in that order. So, Nicholas Lardy.
Thank Thank you, Danny. I'm going to take the question about what China's growth is going to be. I was the principal author of the chapter in the book that's called Sustaining Economic Growth in China, and it's really looking at what the Chinese call rebalancing economic growth, that is having a transition away from investment-led growth and export-led growth towards domestic consumption-led growth, and what kinds of policies they need to do that. And I spend most of the time assessing what those policies are, how effective they might be, and then, of course, what's actually been done. So the context, of course, today is that even though China has come off a 5-year period of accelerating growth, which I think everybody's familiar with, until recently, most people had not noticed that China's growth was already slowing down. We've now had 5 successive quarters of declining growth. It's gone from 12.6% in the second quarter of 2007 to 9% in the quarter that just ended, and is likely to go even lower, certainly in the quarter that we're currently in, and probably lower still as we move through 2009. Obviously, the question is why, and what can be done about it. What sources of growth have weakened? What's the further downside risk? If you look at the first 3 quarters of this year, when they grew at 9.9%, it turns out that about half of the slowdown is because of a reduction in the contribution of net exports to GDP growth. Net exports contributed about 2.4 percentage points in the first 3 quarters of 2007 and about 1.2 percentage points this year, so it's down exactly by half. And that means there's another roughly 1 percentage points decline that's coming from somewhere else. And it seems to be coming primarily from a slowdown in construction activity, which is related to a slump in the housing market. The housing market accounts for about 3/4 of all construction activity, offices and other commercial space and so forth being the other quarter. I would argue that China's vulnerable to a further slowdown because everybody certainly believes, I certainly believe, that global growth is going to slow down. I don't know exactly how much, but certainly China is at risk of losing another 1 to 2 percentage points of economic growth as the global economy slows down as we move through 2007. So that's going to put them down in the roughly 7% range. And if there's a real correction in housing, it could go lower. Now let me just say something about the slowdown in construction. The construction slowdown, as I mentioned, is primarily in housing. We see lots of uncertainties in the housing market. The biggest concern, of course, is that sales activity has collapsed, and I use that word, I think it's accurate. Sales are running at about 20% of the pace of a year ago, primarily because prices are not adjusting. I think there's a widespread expectation that prices will fall more. In August and in September, we saw the first month-over-month price declines in housing in China on an average across the whole country. So there's a decline in sales and at the beginning of a price correction as well. And as construction slows down, we see a very substantial slowing also in industrial production because the main inputs into the construction activity in China, of course, are steel and cement and all the things that are the backbone of the industrial sector, which has been very important as the investment growth rate has been very elevated over the last 4 to 5 years. Instead of growing at 20-30%, production of steel and cement and so forth is now flat. Prices are falling dramatically for steel for the first time in China in quite a few years. So we're at the early stages of a slowdown, and as I say, we're likely to lose at least 1 or 2 more percentage points on the external side, and perhaps additional percentage points of growth if the correction in the housing sector is deep and sustained over a period of time. Now, what's the policy response? We've already seen, again today, we saw interest rates being cut for the 3rd time in 6 weeks. Bank lending quotas have been loosened. Reserve requirements for the banks have been lowered. Down payment requirements on mortgages have been reduced, and interest rates for mortgage lending have been reduced even more than the general benchmark rates for lending. So far, the response is primarily on what I would call the monetary side. I think the risk is that if the property slowdown is based on price expectations, the availability of more credit is not necessarily going to lead to a pickup in activity in the housing sector, and that the monetary easing will not have much effect. I would also say that, and point out that as the external sector softens and Chinese export growth slows down, about 95% of all of Chinese exports are manufactured goods. A very substantial portion of them are produced by private firms or foreign firms. These firms are not going to be jumping to add to their debt to expand capacity as export markets are softening. So I think we will see a slowing of investment activity spreading from housing into manufacturing. About 35% of all manufactured goods in China are exported, so this will not be a small adjustment. And again, I don't think this sector will respond to measures of monetary easing. On the external side, the thing that we have seen two moves so far to increase VAT rebates, that is the value-added tax that's rebated on export products. The first step in this direction was announced as early as July, and the other one was announced this month and will take effect on November 1st. I think this, again, is the wrong way to go. China needs to be addressing its very large external imbalance. I don't think propping up the export sector with preferential policies for labor-intensive products is the right way to go. I think they should be facilitating the shrinkage of the tradable goods sector through assistance targeted at redundant workers that would facilitate the permanent reduction in some of these most labor-intensive industries, rather than measures which prop up profitability and will continue would lead to a continued oversized manufacturing sector. On the policy side, the last thing I would say is that I think eventually China is going to have to move towards expansionary fiscal policy. I think that will have much more effect in the current environment than the monetary easing that we've seen so far. Certain neglected components of infrastructure investment could be increased. Government expenditures on pensions, health, and education should be increased, both because it directly contributes to consumption and also because it would help to reduce the precautionary demand for savings and thus lead to a somewhat greater role for private consumption expenditures in generating GDP growth. That has not happened yet. Finally, I would say the Chinese need to move to reduce repression in the financial sector. One of the reasons that the consumption share of GDP is so low in China today is that household income as a share of GDP is falling. And the main reason for that is that the real rate of interest on bank savings deposits, which is the principal form of household savings, have been declining in real terms very rapidly over the last 5 or 6 years, leading to a reduction in household income significantly below what it would be in a more liberalized financial environment. So the needed policies, I think, are the targeted trade adjustment assistance, the expansionary fiscal policy, both on selected components of infrastructure and social outlays, financial reform that reduces repression, and of course, finally, a need to allow the exchange rate to continue to appreciate. Interestingly, although the Chinese have held the RMB absolutely constant against the dollar over the last 3 months, since this has been a period of unprecedented dollar appreciation on a global basis, the RMB has continued to appreciate on a real trade-weighted basis, even though they've stopped appreciation in terms of their bilateral exchange rate against the dollar. So I would say, just in summary, in terms of implications, I think the party has done the right thing in embracing the idea of having more rebalanced growth. I think that's the way to make growth more sustainable. That was certainly a valid assessment back in 2004 when it was first made. It's certainly more valid today as the prospects for generating growth through increased exports are fading before our eyes. The problem is that in many domains, they've moved too cautiously. On the increase in social expenditures, on the exchange rate, I think would be two good examples. They've moved too cautiously. And in the other domains, such as financial repression, China's actually been moving in the wrong direction over the last 5 years. The system has implicitly taxed households at a higher and higher rate over this period. So actually growth has become more imbalanced over the last 5 years, with a huge increase in reliance on exports and a reduction in the role of consumption in generating economic growth. Again, I don't think monetary policy will necessarily get very much traction in the current environment. I think they need to go more to the policy steps that I outlined, the fiscal stimulus and so forth, ending financial repression, and continuing to allow their exchange rate to appreciate, to rebalance away from exports and towards domestic consumption. Well, if you want to read the details, it's all in Chapter 6.
much, and thank you for sticking to our time limits. Let me turn now to Charles Freeman.
I'm going to speak here if I can and try to pivot rather radically from Nick's excellent presentation on economics and talk about the internal Chinese political dynamic. And it has relevance to the bank and the audience here for reasons I'll get into. This is not just an interesting segue, not just an interesting aside. The popular wisdom outside of China has been that, in terms of political reform, that the Chinese learned a lesson from the collapse of the Soviet Union, that political reform before economic reform is a prescription for self-destruction. And the wisdom has been that China has made an implicit deal with its population that the Communist Party will grant economic reform and openness and allow growth in exchange for the populace not rising up and throwing the Communist Party out of power. In fact, things are a lot more subtle than that, and indeed, the Communist Party's lesson from the Soviet Union was not so much that that political reform was a bad idea. Indeed, political reform is a necessity, according to the Communist Party, but a necessity in order to stay in power, as opposed to a necessity for the broader social good. Although if you're in the Chinese Communist Party, you tend to think that staying in power is part of the broader social good. Clearly, what we've seen in the last 10 years in particular has been a real rise in the public debate in China on political reform in ways that are unprecedented. 30, 40 years ago, the outside world kind of looked at the Chinese polity, peered across the walls that had been set up and really were unable to penetrate what the thinking was within the party about its long-term growth. And in the past 10 years in particular, there has been a remarkable amount of debate within the party that's been evident through the individual think tanks that are there, the universities, and indeed even in the press to some extent. There are, in fact, within the think tank community, there are a number of scholars that are really proxies for the Chinese leadership and for folks within the party. And reading and seeing what they are writing about is a pretty good reflection of what's happening internally in the party. And there's a very robust debate, as I say. Again, it suggests that the party recognizes that political reform is necessary, in large part to preserve itself. And there's a recognition that democracy is very much the end goal, although that democracy will have Chinese characteristics to be sure and won't look anything like someone sitting on Capitol Hill here might interpret as democracy American style. The party, in looking at democracy and what sort of where they should be heading, has looked very actively at every conceivable model of single party dominance, whether it's Singapore, Cuba, and even Japan. Although that the Japan model might change very quickly from being a one-party dominated polity. So, the question is how do they get there and what should it look like? And again, I don't think there's a consensus yet, but there's clearly has been a remarkable transformation in thinking and a remarkable exercise in strategy about the long-term democratization of the party. And you call it intra-party democracy, you call it what you will, it's definitely heading that way. So the question is, what sort of obstacles limit that political evolution? And we in the book tended to focus on two things, and one of them being center-local relationship between Beijing and the far-flung provinces and municipalities, and corruption, which I know again is near and dear to the bank's heart. With respect to corruption, there's one can argue that in relative terms corruption is much better, and if you look at the bank's surveys of where China is on the list in Transparency International, where China is on the list of corrupt countries, it's falling down the list. But there are a number of areas of real concern. And one is the number of younger cadres in the Chinese Communist Party that are engaged in rent-seeking activity is growing rather exponentially, to the extent that it seems more and more that the lack of an ideological base within the Communist Party has created opportunities for younger cadres to really to join the party and to belong to party activities for purely self-interested reasons. That also is breaking down so that you have a number of different polities throughout, or different cities and municipalities throughout China. In Xinpei of Carnegie counts up to 50 that are effectively kleptocracies that exist for the sole purpose of benefiting local officials. And that's a subject that, if you are in the Communist Party and are thinking beyond your own rent-seeking activity, is a matter for great concern. Because ultimately what you're seeing throughout China has been this series of protests that are by and large related to corruption of local officials. There was a count, I think it's up to 87,000 mass incidents, i.e. protests, per year, many of which have to do with corruption. That so far continues to be a local phenomenon. It is not a case of Chinese citizens rising up against the Communist Party writ large, but rather rising up against discernible local corruption, taking away of land, not paying pensions on time, that kind of thing. But if you are sitting in Beijing, that knitting together of that string of pearls of local protests can become a national movement if the center is not doing something to correct it. And that's where center-local relations issues come into play. Americans in particular still tend to think of Hu Jintao and Wen Jiabao and other political figures, political leaders in Beijing as being all-powerful and being able to pretty much have their way throughout China with whatever they want. And the opposite is in fact more close to the truth. Most local officials enjoy tremendous autonomy from Beijing and practice tremendous autonomy from Beijing, not just through corruption, but in the way they go about collecting money, interacting with local businesses, interacting with local governments. Beijing's representatives in many of these communities are marginalized, and in part because they are responsive to local financing and the rest. So that really limits the amount that Beijing can do to actually implement broader policies. Now, maybe democracy is an antidote to that. Maybe democracy, by creating more accountability in the hinterland to the individuals, is a way of allowing the party to exercise more, paradoxically, more control over the local communities than it currently does. But again, that's the ability to implement local democracy in China is limited by Beijing's control over the provinces. So again, it's a catch-22. So how does this all affect, some of the things that Nick was talking about? Well, if, for example, you do need, and I think we all agree, if Beijing needs to begin to employ more fiscal stimulus, more fiscal policy stimuli, to get the economy growing at a period of growth, that requires shifting cash infusions down to the local level to be spent by and large by local officials. Well, if local officials are not marching to Beijing's drum and in fact are exercising rent-seeking activity, that creates a huge conundrum for Beijing, because not only will they not be able to control the disposition of that fiscal stimulus necessarily, but it also implies that a certain percentage, how much is unknown, a certain percentage will be taken for personal gain by local officials that are charged with expending that stimulus. So I think that the question for those of us that say, we're coming to November 15th and beyond, and Hu Jintao comes to Washington, and at least the G20 begins to articulate some sort of global architecture. China is a big part of that, and how China organizes itself and the Chinese government organizes itself to respond to the new challenges of the post-Bretton Woods II architecture is very important. And if China is unable, because of the limits on its authority and the limits on its political activity, that raises some serious challenges for the rest of us. I'll stop there.
Thank you very much. I turn now to Derek Mitchell.
Thank you very much, Danny. First, I want to say thank you to all of you for coming out. I feel like the odd man out here as the sort of foreign policy and security guy around all these economists. So I think that's why I was put in the middle. You can get Fred Bergsten at the end to bring us back to the topics of interest to you all. But clearly, there is a connection between the foreign policy and security strategy and approach of China and the domestic situation of China. And I'll take about 10 minutes to give sort of a brief thematic overview of Chinese foreign policy and security strategy. The first thing to say is that if China doesn't have a grand strategy per se, it has been still quite strategic in its approach to the world. If you look at it, they've been overall quite focused, quite disciplined, if not perfect in its execution. They've been remarkable in their sort of single-minded focus on what they want to achieve and how they want to achieve it. And it is, in fact, driven. Their external policy is still a function of their internal problems, of which they have quite a lot. And anyone here who follows China even remotely understands how consumed they are by a host of challenges, from just simply growing the economy enough to create jobs, the corruption that we've talked about, the quality of life, the environmental degradation, the general disparity of wealth in China, all of this to the end of social stability. The idea of harmony with social stability that really drives, the Chinese leadership every day wakes up and they're not concerned so much about what happens in Europe as what happens inside their country, and whether they have a stable environment in which the Communist Party can thrive and can stay in power for another day or year or more. They are very, very focused inwardly, and their external policy is entirely based on their desire to keep things stable. So let me go through a few of what I see as the key themes and principles of Chinese foreign policy given this. The number one principle and theme that I perceive is defensiveness. The idea that they want to prevent any external actors or any external developments from impacting on China's internal affairs, or distract the leaders from their principal focus on their domestic problems. That means maintaining good relations with the United States. That means maintaining good relations with major powers generally, and keeping their periphery secure. This is a traditional Chinese concern through imperial history as well. They want to keep the periphery stable so they can focus on the heartland. You'll see, of course, that they want to keep things stable with the United States. They're not raising their head too far during the campaign. I think they like the fact that during this campaign the word or the issue of China has not been raised. They want to keep their head down. They want to focus on their own problems. They also focus on the developing world in a defensive way to get votes in the United Nations to protect themselves from certain votes that might impinge on their sovereignty. And they also look to the developing world to balance against the major powers. And we're seeing some of this in the recent days, in the last day or two, and I'll mention that in a moment, how the developing world is becoming, it's already been a theme in Chinese foreign policy, leadership in the developing world, or at least speaking for the developing world. But I think we're seeing it more and more as the conditions of the world deteriorate around us. Second theme that I detect is opportunism. That even though they are defensive, they do look for opportunities to pursue their interests, to gain advantage, and often it is in relation to the United States, where they see if the U.S. falters somewhere, if there's increased resentment or a vacuum that's formed, China is there to pick up the pieces. We see this when the United States and the Philippines had a problem. The next thing you knew, China was in Manila. Russia, a lot of the China-Russia relationship, of course, there's the energy and the resources and arms sales and such, but there's also a degree of commonality and opportunism to the decline in U.S.-Russia relations there. Burma, you see this, Cambodia, other places in Latin America and perhaps in Africa as well. aid policies and its oil investment. They are going places and providing aid and assistance in places that the United States or the West will not go. So they see an opportunity to get in and perhaps gain some advantage, both economically and potentially politically. And now with the U.S. story, the U.S. model having taken a hit over the past month and more, there's a question about the Chinese response to that. So far they've not been too aggressive, but we have seen, as I mentioned, some sort of more assertive statements by China in recent days, for instance, saying they want more say in the IMF. They say the developed world should pay more for climate change, paying for the technologies that reduce climate change, talking about even further and more publicly about a new international economic order, and showing off their model more blatantly. I'll talk in a moment about this idea of a Beijing consensus or whether the Chinese model is somehow appropriate for others, but they are more and more showing off that model to other countries as the Western model seems to falter or show cracks. The third theme, and generally I think Charles talked about it in the sense that China, on everything, not just democracy, but otherwise, listens and learns. They go out and they look at best practices. And they don't change their strategy, they change their tactics and their approach to certain problems. And they're very, very adept at this. In one area they do this and have been focusing very, very actively in the past 15, 20 years is the new concept of soft power. You see them talk and write a lot about the idea, Nai's notion of soft power. And the way the Chinese think about it is thinking about what is the unique contribution that China can make to international ideas, to international society. Harmonious world, Confucianism, win-win solutions, these types of things. They're trying to enhance their reputation, to reassure nations about its rise, but also to promote its own model and its own reputation to enhance what they consider to be soft power. The Olympics were a critical component of this. Anyone who's talked to Chinese, and I've talked to some who've come through town recently, they were still obsessed by the Olympics. They still ask the question, how did this impact? Are people still talking about it? Is our reputation still high? I think most Americans say, yeah, the Olympics, right, that was a couple months ago. We've moved way beyond this. I think it took a few days before the Democratic Convention occurred, and then you had the Republican, the Sarah Palin phenomenon, Republican Convention, a financial crisis. The Olympics seem very far away. The Chinese are still wondering whether that was a success story, and to them that was a coming out party to the world, and very, very important for their soft power and their image. But of course, they have to deal with some other things that are really in the headlines, for instance, food safety and melanin. And they are, from what I understand, quite concerned about the melanin scandals that are hitting not just the West, but all over Asia. It's taking a huge hit to their reputation as a modern society. So they have some problems on the soft power front. Now, finally, the fourth that I would mention is the issue of norms. And you will hear, I think, a bit more about this from Fred Bergsten, who talks about it from the economic perspective and rulemaking in the international system. China claims it doesn't want to change the international system, but there are questions when they talk about a new international economic or political order. And they talk about non-interference in internal affairs. They talk about pure notions of sovereignty, of governance. Again, it's an idea of authoritarian capitalism as a potential model. Harry Harding likes to say, and I think he's right, that China tends not to promote its own model. I think they do a little bit more of that recently. But what they say is the model is that there is no model, that it's a laissez-faire. Everyone to their own, and don't buy into a Washington consensus. Everyone figure out for themselves what works for you, and we will support you without any conditions, without any concerns, through aid and other support. They also oppose alliances, and they talk about alliances versus so-called strategic partnerships. And then there's the idea of law, international law versus propriety. We talk about in the book, when there's a crisis, they talk a lot about the notion of international law. But when it comes down to a crisis like the EP3 incident, the spy plane incident in 2001, or other incidents, WTO problems, they don't talk about what is the law, they talk about what is right, or what is appropriate. And so this idea of law versus propriety is a little bit of a concern when it comes to the international order and how they enforce it. Now, despite the softer approach, they do have traditional harder side to what they do, and Those other two chapters refer to those. Military modernization remains just like their overall foreign policy since 1993, very systematic, very focused, very strategic, and very comprehensive development of their military. Double-digit growth every year, and not just about Taiwan. This is it's altering the regional balance of power, and it's creating a lot more attention in the region, and particularly from the United States. It's not an economics thing, but it's something we strategists and security hands think about, the balance of power, and we have commitments in East Asia, and this requires our attention, their military modernization. And one of those regional commitments, of course, is Taiwan. Taiwan still is extremely sensitive to China, and the title of my chapter, if you look at the book, is Why Does the United States Still Care About Taiwan? Because I get this question all the time. Why? Because China's so big, so important. Do we care about this small island that seems to be a relic of the Cold War, that just gets in the way of good U.S.-China relations, that's so sensitive to China? And I think the key answer to that is how we deal with that traditional commitment to Taiwan is not only a matter of values and interests, but also has to do with how we deal with a rising China. Because a rising China will demand that we cut corners on our commitments and may challenge or test the United States to cut these corners. And the question is, how are we going to respond? And other nations, other allies are looking to us to determine how we are responding to a rising China in principle. So I'll leave it at that when it comes to that chapter. Finally, just in conclusion, as suggested in the idea that they listen and learn, there are raging debates in China that are ongoing on all manner of issues. It is somewhat fluid in China, though they are, I think, adhering pretty closely to principle. I think it's a theme of the book. There's an actual chapter by Melissa Murphy about debates going on in China on a whole host of issues. And this year is the 30th anniversary of the reform and opening up policy in China, and those debates continue. There are a host of conferences and studies being done right now to determine where China should go in the next 30 years. The Olympics were a sort of watershed, and now they're taking stock of where they are. But the sense of competition as well as partnership, I think, will continue to mark U.S.-China relations. The U.S. goal will continue to be integrating China, to be giving a greater role and a greater voice to China in return for greater responsibility from China in return. This will be, I think, an ongoing dialogue between the two sides. China wants voice, a greater voice, but traditionally has resisted the responsibility that comes along with it. Deng Xiaoping had a famous maxim in the early 1990s, and he said, and it's widely quoted, and I'll just quote it here, "Observe calmly, secure our position, cope with affairs calmly, hide our capacities, bide our time, be good at maintaining a low profile, and never claim leadership." There are some questions about some aspects and some of the interpretation of that. Basically, they're saying, what I suggest is I think they want to keep a low profile, focus on their domestic challenges, and don't claim leadership, don't take a leading role because they have enough problems at home. I think this remains the general instinct of the Chinese leadership. They want to keep their focus inward, but I think events may force their hand. The evolution may be quicker than they prefer, which may not be a bad thing for the United States. I think it is probably about time that we do recognize the changing dynamics in international society and changing nature of power, international power, and competition, I should say. I think this would probably sound good in this audience. Competition in political and international affairs, just like economic affairs, may be healthy if it's channeled responsibly. We may find the competition of China in Africa and elsewhere, and their challenge to America's model, etc., may be something that hones our own policy, may force us to focus once again on our own international policy, and may indeed lead to win-win solutions. But I'll conclude by saying uncertainty is the key word on everything China. You ask Chinese what their future holds for them, and they say, we don't know. So if they don't know, we don't know. And I think given global developments, the uncertainty of what we're going to, the depths of our own problems at home and in the world, I think there's no question that China needs to be part of the conversation in dealing with them. So I'll conclude with that. Thank you.
We now turn to the cleanup hitter.
On the day when the baseball season may finally end, happy to be cleanup hitter and start with a short advertisement for the book. This book is, we think, rather unique It's the product of a 3-year cooperative project between CSIS and our Peterson Institute for International Economics. We produced an earlier book 2 years ago called China the Balance Sheet, What the World Needs to Know Now About the Emerging Superpower. And this book carries all that analysis much further and draws lots more precise policy conclusions, both for China and for the China-U.S. relationship. What we think is unique about the book, and it's on display here, is that it tries to bring together the whole range of China issues. The evolution of its internal politics and economics, its foreign policy and national security, its role in the world economy, tries to bring together and to a degree integrate those different components of China's own evolution to suggest where China might be going and how that might be constructively modified, and also where China's relationship with the United States and the rest of the world may be going, and what would be sensible policies for the U.S. and other countries in responding toward China. That's the rather ambitious goal of this 3-year project. We have tried to forge integration of that type in our work, and we commend it to you with that thought. I should note that books will be on sale after the session out front. And we authors will be there to autograph the books if you want. Now, we authors have a kind of, you might say, morbid interest in which of our signatures you will like. Lardy and I, as economists, will be looking to find an auction price for the relative value of the signatures of the different authors and to see how you all evaluate the merit, if any, of signatures from the authors when you buy the book, but you're invited to do so. My chapter 1 in the book is entitled China's Challenge to the Global Economic Order. And if I had to do it over again, I probably would say, and the global economic challenge to China, because the causality really runs in both directions. And I'll try to explain 3 or 4 reasons for that and wind up with some policy conclusions, particularly for the United States, but in concert with China as 2 of the key players in the world economy. The first point, the obvious one, is of course China's critical importance to the world economy. China is one of only 3 global economic superpowers in business today: the United States, the European Union, and China. But the European Union, except for a few very specific policy areas, doesn't have a common policy and doesn't speak with one voice. So interestingly, only the United States and China are global economic superpowers who do have, at least on most issues, unitary national policies that they project into the world economy. At the end of my remarks, I will make a rather bold suggestion for an informal U.S.-China G2 to help steer global economic developments in the future, based in large part on that reality that these are the world's only 2 economic superpowers who can speak with a single voice across the array of economic issues, and therefore deal in that sense in a comprehensive and consistent and reasonably coherent way with each other. You probably know most of the statistics about China. Its economy, depending which exchange rate you use, is now 2nd or 3rd largest in the world. More important, I think, it's been the #1 driver of global economic growth now for several years. Remember that at purchasing power parity, which is the way the IMF, the bank, and we at the Institute and most people calculate it, China accounts for about 10% of the world economy. If it's growing at 10%, that means it accounts for 1 full percentage point of world economic growth. And even if Nick's right, it drops down to 8%, then it's still accounting for 0.8% a year of world economic growth. Well, world economic growth now is probably dropping down into the 2.5% to 3% range, and that means China alone accounts for 1/4 to 1/3 of global economic growth. More than the United States, certainly during this period of recession in the United States, and in fact about equal to the U.S. even in the recent boom period of the 2003-2006 years. So China is a big, big driver in the world economy. It's not only in macro terms, it's at the micro level too. If we think about energy policy, global warming concerns, China consumes about 3 to 5 times, depending how you calculate it, as much raw materials per dollar of output as the U.S. and EU, the industrial countries, do. It's a big, big player, and that explains why it's been such a factor in the recent huge run-up of global commodity prices from energy through food and copper and iron ore and the like. On the international side, China, of course, runs by far, the largest current account surplus, not only in the current world for any big country, but in history by any big trading country. More than 10% of GDP over several years on a consistent basis. That is just unprecedented in human history. And as a result of that, China, of course, has by far, again, the largest buildup of foreign exchange reserves in the world, now getting close to $2 trillion, about double that of the runner-up Japan. So however you look at it, China is really a dominant factor in the world economy. In discussions of this type, sometimes people talk about China and India, and I'm a big fan of India, and I think over time it will too become an important international economic player, but at the moment, of course, there is no comparison. The annual increase in China's trade exceeds the total level of India's trade. The amount of annual foreign investment in China exceeds the cumulative foreign investment in India since its independence in 1947. There is no comparison. China is a global economic superpower. Neither India nor anybody else is in that ballpark yet. So, the obvious first point, China is a global economic power. Its effect, its actions, its policies, its performance have big, often decisive effects on the world economy, and we simply have to recognize that in structuring the global economic order for the future. But the flip side, which is in a way at least as interesting, is that the world economy is at least equally critical to China itself. As Nick pointed out, China's very rapid growth in recent years has relied very heavily on the steady, sizable increases in its external surpluses. That accounted for 2-3 percentage points of its 10-11% growth in the recent period. Now that growth component is coming down. The Chinese, of course, are terrified that it may flatten out or even turn negative. What that means is, of course, not that they are condemned to lower growth, but they have to change their development model in the direction Nick was suggesting, to rely more heavily on domestic demand expansion to pick up the slack. But in recent years, they have been highly dependent on the world economy to provide the very rapid growth rates that have been so critical for the success of the party, the internal politics that it pursues, and indeed China's big economic role that I described. But in a more fundamental way, even more fundamental than the buildup of surpluses, which is inherently temporary because it's unsustainable for both domestic Chinese reasons and global reasons, even more significant in a way is China's deep, deep integration in the world economy on a strategic basis. When the Deng Xiaoping reforms began 30 years ago, China was, of course, virtually a closed economy, less than 5% exports and imports in the total GDP. The number is now more than 60. China is by far the most open of any of the big developing economies in the world. If you measure by imports plus exports over GDP, the number in China is well over 60 and continuing to rise. In the US, for example, it's about 30, the EU about the same, Japan about 20. So China is 2 to 3 times more open than the big industrial countries in terms of its integration in the world economy. If you look at trade barriers, still lots of complaints. China does still have barriers. We work on those all the time, try to bring them down. But if you do a calculation, as Nick did recently, comparing customs collections to import value, the realized level of actual protection in China is about 2%. And even if you look at its nominal tariff rates, they've come down well into single digits, much, much lower than any of the other big industrial developing countries, Brazil, India, any of the other countries with which it is often compared. So contrary to what is often an opinion on Capitol Hill or elsewhere, China, far from being closed and protectionist, is incredibly open. And indeed, China made a conscious decision in joining the WTO a decade ago, to use its integration in the world economy and its adoption of global rules to promote internal reforms and overcome opposition to those reforms. Charles talked, I think, in a very sophisticated and important way about the differences between the central authorities and the provinces in China. One way the central authorities have tried to overcome provincial resistance to reform is by integrating into the world economy, accepting global rules that then had to be implemented around the country in general. Long Young, too, who many of you probably know, negotiated WTO entry for China. After he negotiated entry, spent the next 3 years traveling around the country, telling the local party chieftain, the mayors, the provincial governors, these are the new rules of the road. Sorry, fellas, you have to live up to this. We're now committed as a country, and you can't get away with a lot of that stuff you did in the past. Well, as Charles also pointed out, they still get away with a lot of that stuff and try to, but this was a very conscious policy tool used by the authorities at the center to promote internal reform. Another reason that many of us feel that China should be using the exchange rate tool much more actively to promote its economic goals, to fight inflation, to avoid mispricing of investment within the country, to strengthen the banking system. We feel that the exchange rate is a tool through which the central authorities can exercise effective control over the country, as with monetary policy, as with fiscal policy to a lesser extent, because some of that's still done in the provinces. But exchange rate policy, like trade policy, gives the center a lever to use very extensively and effectively as it seeks to manage this huge and very complex economy. So the bottom line is that not only is China critical to the world, but the world is critical to China. And if that's the case, then the third conclusion would be it's hugely in China's interests to promote a stable, prosperous, and effective global economic order. The U.S., many Europeans, Japanese to some extent, have taken that view in the past because of the importance of the world economy to them, and one would believe and hope that as these realities eventuate, that China would see it in its interest to play a constructive, positive, and leadership role in maintaining and indeed evolving and reforming a global economic system that would be supportive of their interests and their proclivities. So, the question that I really ask in my chapter in this book and some of our ongoing work as we study all this is whether China has in fact stepped up to exercise that responsibility and leadership. Has it recognized the importance that the world economy plays for it and critical for a rapidly rising power? Does it recognize the impact it has on the world and through that feeding back into China itself? And the simple answer, I conclude, is at this point, no. China has not recognized those relationships and indeed is not yet playing the kind of constructive leadership role that it needs to, both to pursue its own interests, but also if the world economy is to be prosperous and stable. Indeed, as you look through the set of Chinese policies in key areas of global economic affairs, you find some very disruptive, uncooperative, and indeed worrisome policies. The most obvious, of course, is the exchange rate, where China, for at least the last 5 years, has blatantly violated the most fundamental rules of the International Monetary Fund and the global financial system. By which I, of course, mean China's massive intervention in the currency markets to keep the renminbi grossly undervalued. That's been a critical element in pushing these global surpluses to the unprecedented levels that I mentioned, and causing both a pushback in terms of protectionist trade reactions against China in the rest of the world, but also creating, as Nick has outlined in his chapter of the book, huge distortions within the Chinese economy that are not in their own interest and are certainly not sustainable over time. The IMF has made some halting efforts to deal with the issue. The Chinese have stiffed those, have not even permitted the usual annual consultation process to play through and be discussed at the board and published and all that. So it's a pretty blatant violation of some of the fundamental principles of the global economic system. In more crass political terms, it has, of course, led to charges around the world, including in our own Congress, certainly in Europe, and in many developing countries, Mexico, India, others, of unfairness on the part of the Chinese. Here's the world's most competitive economy, making itself even more competitive through what really are violations of international norms and rules, and that adds to the tension that is generated in the world by China's surpluses and its global economic ascent. In the trade policy area, China did play a major role in blowing up the Doha round back in July. India was up front and, for its own internal political reasons, was not only willing but happy to proclaim its opposition to the Doha deal. But China gave it critical cover, joined it in the final round of the negotiations, and it's not clear that without China, India would have been able to block the deal all on its own. So China there played, again, a most unhelpful and disruptive role. Peculiar for a country so dependent on trade, running huge surpluses, depending on the rest of the world to keep its markets open, but blocking the main global effort to open markets further and avoid backsliding of the global economic system. Does not seem to be consistent with the country's own interests, particularly when it blew it up, at least nominally, over some really trivial issues having to do with access to markets for imported agricultural products. More broadly, in the trade area, China has been actively involved and indeed providing some leadership for the development toward a regional trading regime in Asia. Call it a bit hyperbolically an Asian trading bloc, which if it eventuated would then become one of three poles, along with the European Union, US or NAFTA bloc, in a tripolar global system, which might also be quite destabilizing and disruptive of global economic order, depending how it was played, but could very much move in that direction. Derek already mentioned the foreign assistance and energy policy areas, where much of China's behavior in recent years has also been in violation, or at least ignoring, the international norms and guidelines that have come to characterize the global system of the day. Now, I don't want to be totally negative on this, because China has taken some steps, particularly of late, that I think are more constructive. It turns out that this is the second time we've presented this book. And on both days we have presented the book, there have been major interest rate cuts by both China and the United States. Now, the first one was explicitly coordinated. That was in the teeth of the crisis 3 weeks ago, when the U.S. Orchestrated the 6 industrial countries, but China also, the same day, same amount, participated in cutting interest rates to help deal with the financial crisis. They've done it again today, and focused largely on internal affairs, but having very positive contribution to the international side, particularly on the same day when the Fed cuts rates here, and adds to the sense of international effort by the two big economic superpowers in the direction of promoting more effective response to both the financial crisis and creating stimulus to at least lessen the adverse impact of the recession going forward. China will be coming to the G20 summit here in 2 weeks. That in and of itself is highly constructive that under U.S. leadership, the G20, not the G7, will be meeting as the main crisis reform group. This provides an opportunity for China, I think, to step up. One of the needs for the G20 coming up in 2 weeks will be to add to the monetary stimulus a fiscal stimulus effort. The U.S. is clearly going to do it anyway, led by the Democratic Congress and probably the new administration here. So it's an easy one for the U.S. As Nick pointed out, China needs to undertake fiscal stimulus measures for a lot of reasons, some structural, some related to the inevitable reduction in its external surplus, and so that will be an early test if China does it. What does all this imply for U.S. policy? Well, I'm about out of time, so you can read it in the book, but let me give you just the bottom line. The bottom line, I think, as I hinted at the outset, is that U.S. policy has to recognize that only by really intimate cooperation with China will we be able to create and maintain over the next years and decades a stable and effective international economic order. I think current U.S. policy is moving in the right direction. Bob Zoellick, now president of this building, got it going with his strategic dialogue when he was at the State Department. Hank Paulson picked that up. Zoellick called it the strategic, what do you call it? Senior dialogue. Paulson escalated it to the cabinet level, the strategic economic dialogue. What I suggest is that it needs to go at least one step further. We need to have annual summits between the heads of state of the United States and China. We need to develop intense working relationships across the whole range of economic issues in what I call loosely, and to kind of catch attention, a G2. Not that I would call it that formally or propose that they call it that, but that they develop that kind of working relationship. I would get it started in two policy areas where we must have new international regimes, in areas where we do not have them: global warming and regulation of sovereign wealth funds. In neither of those areas will it be possible to have an effective international economic order without China as well as the United States. And therefore I suggest that in those two areas, the U.S. should begin the process, not of trying to co-opt China into the current international regime, which has been the policy to date, but rather working sincerely and actively with China to craft, perhaps in some cases, new rules of the road, new operating modalities that will permit the G2, the two superpowers who speak with a single voice, to help lead the next phase of global economic governance.
I was curious to get the perspective of everybody on the panel about China's activities so far to counteract their slowing economic growth in terms of boosting textile exports, cutting back rebates on 3,000 export goods earlier this week, seem to show that so far they're not moving in the direction that Dr. Lardy advocated in terms of boosting domestic consumption or moving towards infrastructure spending in order to stimulate the economy in ways that is currently slowing in China. I'm wondering, what are the implications for that for the U.S. next year? Are we going to see an increase in some sort of protectionist backlash in the House of Representatives and the Senate next year when Congress comes back with a slightly different makeup? What does that do in terms of the next administration's willingness to sit down at the SED? Or will we see some sort of more grand discussion in Washington in terms of what that means overall for U.S. competitiveness? Thank you.
Okay, that's a good question. My assumption or suggestion is that we take 2 or 3, and then we'll ask the panelists to reply. Gentleman in the blue shirt.
2 quick questions. First is about the exchange rate issue. Is the exchange rate issue as bad as Mr. Bergsten and Mr. Lardy are saying? If you look at the econometric evidence, it's quite varied. The studies, some show that the exchange rate is relatively it's not much undervalued. Other studies show 40%. So that's the first one. The second point is China, if it was so mercantilistic, why is it running deficits with several other Asian countries? And the third point related to that exchange rate, what Robert Mundell said, is if you have a huge revaluation of renminbi, what is going to be the welfare impact of that? What's going to be the impact on employment? And finally, just a question on China's overall role in the world, which is, would you all agree with the comment that China wants to be a good global citizen, but there are areas where there's going to be increasing competition for oil and natural resources where there may be a more conflictual role? Thank you.
Okay, thank you. We'll have 4 questions because they were all good ones, but we'll try to go for 1.
Just one quick question. If I recall properly, I took a look at the table of contents yesterday of the book. There was a chapter on energy in the book. So I just was wondering, any comments about energy security in China? As you know, they use a lot of coal as far as I know, and they are going to nuclear energy as well. So I just wanted to hear any comments on energy security in China. Thank you.
Just one quick
product of the global political economic news. This is from Mr. Bergsten. I was wondering if he believes that his proposed G2 of the U.S. and China would be sustainable without the involvement of the European.
Okay. What's the count? Would you like to 1 hour or should we take 2 more? Okay. Let's take these 2 last questions. Go ahead, and then we will reply.
I'm Tom Sui. I had the pleasure of working in China from 1978, and glad to see that the work of some of our team, I don't know, I think Nellie Lichtenstein and Anthony Tofodi have left, but some other people might still be here who were working in China in the late 70s and early 80s. So we're glad to see that a few things work for as a result of our effort. The real question is, looking forward, what can the World Bank do, given what you said, to help China?
I have 2 quick questions. The first one is about the GDP growth. As you presented, of course, everyone knows about China's GDP growth is almost 2 digits over the 30 years. So the question is, how is the quantity? In terms of quality of the GDP growth, I just wonder, how do you characterize this, or what's your stand on that? In terms of energy resource, energy consumption, and also per dollar, and being intensity, and also the resources. For example, this type of the quality of the so-called green GDP in some scholars do prefer. Second question is that right now, currently, since the global economy is going down, and China trying to shift its focus to domestic consumption, domestic demand. So my question is that if this domestic demand increase at this moment, and what about another 2 years or 3 years or 5 years when the global economy grown up? Do you think this is that in terms of resources availability and competition about energy and resources? Do you think that China, given its scale in population, do you think that the whole world, it can support this kind of big boom at the moment? So this is in the long term.
Okay, thank you very much. My suggestion is that we go in the order of the speakers, and there have been a number of questions on growth. So I think maybe we can start with you. That's great.
I'll say something. Let me take the last question first on the quality of growth question. I think it's important to recognize, we all know the rap on China for the energy intensity of its economic growth and its vast increase in emissions over the last few years. But I think we also should remember in the first 25 years of economic reform, the energy intensity of economic growth declined very, very substantially. If you look at the energy elasticity of GDP growth, it was running at about 0.4. In other words, there were dramatic improvements. Where they went off the track was really at the beginning of the current decade, from around 2001 onward, and that was a function of a number of policy choices that they made. Their currency became increasingly undervalued. They started exporting goods in which they had no real, I think, underlying comparative advantage. They fell off the wagon in terms of their previous progressive policies on pricing of energy, all of which tilted the combination of underpricing of energy, an undervalued currency, and also interest rates that were too low, which was in turn a function of the undervalued exchange rate. They didn't want to raise rates up for fear of attracting even more capital inflow. All of this led to first of all, the share of investment going into manufacturing doubled. The share of investment going into services fell substantially. So the whole production structure, I think, has become very substantially distorted. Between the early 80s and 2000, the share of GDP coming from services doubled. It went from about 21% up to about 40%. In the last 6 or 7 years, the share of GDP coming out of the service sector has actually declined by almost 2 percentage points. In other words, the growth in the service sector relative to the rest of the economy has come to a halt. This is an extremely unusual, if not totally unprecedented pattern for a relatively low-income, rapidly growing economy. So I certainly think if they were able now to get back to a more balanced growth strategy through a combination of policy initiatives, that it would make their long-term growth much, much more sustainable, both from an internal point of view and from an external point of view. It would dramatically reduce the energy intensity of growth. It would get rid of the big external imbalance, which, as Fred said, is really unprecedented. And it would lead to more growth of the service sector, so it would be more job creating than what they've had over the last 5 years, which quite frankly has not created very many new jobs. So it would, in general, improve the quality of growth. It would also lead to a very substantial increase in consumption. Chinese consumption, personal consumption or household consumption as a share of GDP is the lowest of any country in the world. So if you look at what happened over recent years, of course GDP growth is off the charts, but consumption growth is well below the growth of GDP. So the population has not really participated in the gains from this very rapid economic growth. And so I would certainly say from that perspective, I would say the quality of growth in the last 5 years, to some extent earlier, but particularly in the last 5 or 6 years, has been quite low. So I think there's plenty of room to adjust. I think if they do adjust, it makes their growth more sustainable, both from an internal perspective and from an external perspective.
Okay, let me turn to Charles and Derek. One question was, does China want to be a good global citizen? So what's the balance between being a competitor and being responsible for the system? And then I would add to that, for either of you, the question about China's role in Africa, which is quite interesting for people at the World Bank to observe. Does it fit into your defensive or offensive category, Derek?
With respect to the global citizen question, let me defer quickly and answer Dan's question about trade and the export incentives that China is putting up now to try to stimulate growth that way, and whether that will become a political issue with the new Congress, American Congress in the spring. I think there's a very good chance that will happen. I would like to think that our political leadership here will be enlightened and will focus on issues of domestic competitiveness and challenge itself to put forward policies that make it easier for U.S. Workers and businesses to respond to global competitiveness challenges rather than seek to focus on protection. So I will try to be optimistic there, but the math is pretty easy to do. If China focuses solely on raising exports, I'm not sure that the U.S. market will be that receptive to new incentives, but certainly that the policies of the Chinese government to try to encourage more exports, particularly to the United States, will not be met kindly by the new Congress, who is being elected in large part by an electorate that is quietly cross about China as a economic and jobs issue. On the question of China's good global citizenship, there was a minor American politician a couple years ago that challenged China to become a responsible stakeholder. I'm not sure what's become of that fellow, but it was pretty prescient. I think the point there is U.S. policy for the past 30-some-odd years has been try to draw China into the global order of the U.S. construction, largely, with apologies to our European and other friends, and to try to use that drawing in as a way to neutralize the challenge that China would present to the global order. And that made a lot of sense in '78 when China was 0.5% of global GDP. Now that it's hovering around 10%. That's a big chunk to try to integrate into a global order and not believe that order will change. So I think the notional thing has been, well, with respect to China's growth, China did grow as a result of that integration, and so of those to whom much is given, much is expected. And I think that's been U.S. policy for the last few years in particular, has been to say, okay, you brought here, and you can call it an alternative development model, but it happened under the stewardship of the global order, and therefore you need to give back if you believe in it. And there are questions now about whether that global order is sustainable given China's presence in it. And I think that's the issue that Fred is getting at. Whether it's a good global citizen I think the jury's out. I mean, you can look at its role in Africa, and there is much to admire in what they're doing there. There's also clearly much that is self-interested in what they're doing in Africa, and enlightened self-interest is a fine thing, and we should all support it. But I think one has to recognize that this is not pure, not devoid of profit motive. The good thing about China's role in Africa and China's role in Latin America and efforts to reach out through ODA and others is that it's challenged the United States in particular to look back at the continent and look back at Latin America and to try to re-engage for reasons that have more to do with reinvigorating our own soft power as a response to the rise of Chinese soft power. So I think the competition from China in that respect is a very good thing.
Well, it's hard to supplement that, and I think it was pretty comprehensive, but on the question of China wanting to be a global good citizen versus the competition for resources, I think if it comes down to a balance and a choice, China's going to choose the latter, which is to get the resources any way it can, because it has to feed the beast. It has, I mean, it is riding quite an economy and quite a dragon at home. If the Communist Party is going to stay in power, which is the #1 concern of that government, and has to keep social stability and keep the legitimacy, it has to maintain economic growth. It has to make sure the Chinese people believe that tomorrow is going to be better than yesterday, and their kids' lives are going to be better than their lives, just like, I suppose, any society. But they are desperate to get whatever resources they can suck up and put into that large machine that's called China nowadays. And if it means they have to cut corners and do whatever's necessary, they will. That's the realist, cynical view. There is, though, of course, other positive views, ways you can look at this, particularly when it comes to energy, where, there is, oil's a fungible source. You put more oil on the market, it's not as if it's being taken away from anyone. Resources right now are abundant enough that China developing more doesn't take away from any. So, at least for the foreseeable future, the idea of competition for scarce resources is not a present danger. And I think what is being discussed right now is a partnership between the United States and China and others, and Japan and others, on alternative energy. And I think this will spur partnership as much as competition. The desire on both sides, a desperate need on all sides, to find sustainable resources, renewable resources over time. And hopefully the lowering of oil prices doesn't derail that incentive. That certainly can cause a problem if under those circumstances. The issue of China's role in Africa, whether it's offensive or defensive, I would, as I think about it, probably use 3 of the other words that I used. One is opportunistic, in the sense that, as I said before, that the United States may not have been playing, or the West generally has not been playing or paying much attention. They were playing as the best role it could in Africa, and China was able to get in and get on the side of certain authoritarian governments and gain advantage. There's also the issue of a market. I mean, China simply saw a ready market, resources they need, UN votes, also to isolate Taiwan. A lot of the nations that recognize the Republic of China on Taiwan are in Africa. And also the issue of the developing world, supporting the developing world, which China, as I mentioned in my presentation, is making very much a leading theme. So it's an opportunity for it to gain certain status and stature in the international system. But there is the issue of norms, which makes it less defensive and more offensive. I'm not sure they're seeking to change norms through their actions. That's their intention to do so, but simply by their engagement in the way they engage on aid, which I'm sure is where the World Bank is particularly concerned, on corruption, good governance, environmental standards. The way they engage is changing potentially as a competitive a negative competition on the issue of norms. The positive attention is what Charles said, which is, I think, on more attention from the West as a result.
Okay, we're going to ask Fred to answer on the exchange rate issue and on whether G2 is too small a G. But I want to remind you that we are going to close within 5 minutes, and that books will be for sale outside, and we'll put Fred's auction price model to the test. out there, so don't go away.
Actually, I'll answer the 4 systemic questions that were raised. First, by the gentleman from Inside U.S. Trade. China's increased resort to export subsidies in the teeth of the global financial and economic crisis is a prime example of the anti-systemic behavior that I was talking about. There has not been so much discussion yet, but it will come, that in the face of the global turndown, there will be a big risk that lots of countries will adopt beggar thy neighbor policies. Remember that what made the Great Depression great was not only monetary and fiscal policy errors, but the smooth hauling tariff and the spiraling down of world trade. And as sure as day follows night, we're going to have efforts of that type in this environment. What is particularly alarming is that this is the world's largest surplus country, being one of the first to take actions to subsidize its exports and boost that surplus even more. To put it mildly, that is behavior not consistent with the kind of systemic leadership I'm talking about. There was a question, what can the World Bank do to help China now? One is to help persuade it not to take such foolish measures. Foolish in its own interest, because to undermine the global trade system on which it depends so heavily is the inevitable result of its taking actions of that type. I think one cannot be too critical of what it has done. Note that in addition to putting on export subsidies, it's also put on export controls. It's limited its exports of fertilizer, which make a number of your African countries have much greater difficulties pursuing agricultural output, having come to rely on Chinese fertilizer as critical inputs. So the Chinese are manipulating in both directions their export flows in ways that, again, to put it mildly, are antisocial and are disruptive of a global economic order in which they should have a very keen interest. On the exchange rate, of course, there are studies all over the lot, but every serious study, repeat, every serious study, shows that the renminbi is substantially undervalued. The range of serious studies is between 20 and, say, 40%. The good news in the current environment is that China has let the renminbi ride the dollar up since the dollar has been going back up. That's taken the RMB up against many other currencies, since most have run down against the dollar, but it doesn't do anything for the dollar-RMB relationship, which is still way, way out of line, way undervalued, as those huge increases in surpluses indicate. The gentleman asked, why then does China have deficits with other Asians? Well, 2 obvious reasons. One is many of the other Asians are undervalued too. They've essentially pegged to the RMB and stayed undervalued against the dollar as well. But the other is the division of labor within Asia, where many other countries are providing inputs to goods that are finally produced in China. China runs deficits with them, bringing their intermediate goods into China, then sell the exports to the U.S., the EU, other highly industrial countries. And so if you want to systematically analyze all that, you should in some sense look at the East Asian countries together. His final question was, what would a huge revaluation do for welfare and unemployment in China? Well, none of us, at least on the responsible end of the spectrum, call for a huge revaluation at this time. As Nick said, China has let the exchange rate issue get way out of hand and way out of its control. It should have begun revaluing seriously at least 5 years ago. There were top officials within China who recognized that and wanted to do it, but were shouted down. And so China got more and more behind the curve. The undervaluation of the RMB has actually increased over the last several years as its underlying competitive position has got stronger. So the best you can do is hope for a steady, real appreciation of the currency, phased in, managed over 3 or 4 years to achieve a kind of equilibrium level. And they've begun to move in that direction. But like Nick said, with so many other issues, too little, too late, a lot of catching up to be done. Final question, is the G2 sustainable without the Europeans? Of course not. As I said, Europe's the other economic superpower. It would have to be involved in any major structural systemic decisions. But I'm talking about a kind of inner steering committee where China's role now becomes so critical and, as all these examples show, so deviant from the global norm in various areas that it's simply going to have to be engaged in the most effective, pragmatic way to bring it into systemic evolution. If the Europeans can get their act together and deal with the U.S. and China in that basis, fine. Make it a G3. But let's get on with the process and make sure China is involved, else the global system is not going to look very happy over the coming years and decades.
Okay, let me close by, there was a question about whether if consumption picks up in China 2-3 years from now, it'll be excess demand, and I think the answer there is that relative prices will change in most countries, China included, over time. Export less or export higher value-added exports. I don't think there's a problem there. On what the World Bank can do, since I'm the World Bank guy on this panel, I would say that we can, on the aid side, coming back to Africa, we can provide some sort of connectivity so that if it's not totally offensive, China actually can learn from the experience of some of the OECD countries and try to provide aid in ways that are more beneficial to Africa. On the second area we can help is in climate change. I think there's a connectivity role that can be played between those that may have to help in financing climate change abatement and those that need to do the abating, China included. And thirdly, we can help on the quality of growth point that Nick mentioned. We've been engaged a lot over the years in China on poverty issues and distribution issues, and it's more outside advisory opinion that the Chinese can either accept or decline. I think over the years, a lot of what the bank has said has been quietly accepted, and it's been a very mature dialogue on some of these points. So I think the nature of the relationship obviously changes over time, and the bank needs to change with it. So with that, I'd like to thank you all for coming. Please give our authors a round of applause and then go forward.